The medical bay on Meridian Station was designed to handle emergencies for 73 different species and could adjust its atmospheric composition and gravity and temperature to accommodate everything from aquatic methane breathers to silicon-based life forms that existed as living crystal matrices, and the equipment lining the walls represented technology from across the galaxy, with each piece calibrated to read the specific biomarkers and vital signs unique to different forms of life. But none of the medical staff had ever treated a human before because humans were still new to galactic society. And most of what the doctors knew about human biology came from second-hand reports and brief data packets that Earth had transmitted. When making first contact 3 years earlier, Taman lay on a medical platform that had adjusted itself to approximate human proportions, while a dozen different scanning devices hummed and beeped around him, and Hyejin stood guard nearby, refusing to leave his side despite repeated requests from the medical staff who insisted they needed space to work. And she watched every move they made with suspicious eyes because she was not about to let aliens experiment on her business partner and friend without proper oversight. Do-hyun arrived 40 minutes after the incident began, and he moved through the medical bay with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, despite being in an alien facility surrounded by equipment he had never seen before. And he introduced himself as a human medical researcher who happened to be on the station conducting a study of comparative biology across species. And he had heard about the human who survived Zephyrium-9 exposure and came immediately because this was the kind of data that could revolutionize their understanding of human resilience. The lead physician was a tall, willowy creature with too many joints in its limbs and skin that shifted colors based on its emotional state, and it regarded Do-hyun with what might have been relief or suspicion or hunger, because the translator could not quite capture the nuance of its native language, and it explained that Taman's vital signs were stable and showed no indication of neurotoxin damage despite the fact that their scanners clearly showed Zephyrium-9 present in his bloodstream at concentrations that should have killed him several times over. Do-hyun requested access to the medical data and began running his own analysis using a portable computer he carried everywhere, and his fingers flew across the holographic interface, while his eyes scanned rows of numbers and graphs that meant nothing to anyone without extensive training in biochemistry and xenobiology. And after several minutes he looked up with an expression that mixed fascination with dawning horror. The toxin was definitely in Taman's system, but his liver was processing it like any other foreign substance and breaking it down into harmless compounds that his kidneys would filter out naturally over the next few hours, and his immune system had barely reacted because it did not recognize the toxin as a threat, and his cellular structure showed no damage whatsoever from exposure to a substance that caused catastrophic neural collapse in almost every other known species. Hyejin wanted to know if Taman was going to be okay, and Do-hyun assured her that he was fine and would probably feel completely normal within an hour or two, once the last traces of the toxin worked their way out of his system. And then he added, almost as an afterthought, that this incident raised some very serious questions about human biology and how it compared to other galactic species. Station security had not left, and the head of security was a massive reptilian creature named Orndal, who stood nearly 8 feet tall, with scales that looked like they could deflect small arms fire, and eyes that tracked everything in the room with predatory focus. And he demanded to know whether this was an assassination attempt or some kind of elaborate hoax, because either option represented a serious breach of station protocols and would require extensive investigation. Velkar had been brought to the medical bay under guard, and the Chithrax merchant stood in the corner with antennae drooping in a posture that Do-hyun's translator identified as profound distress and shame. And Velkar insisted repeatedly that the beverage was a traditional ceremonial drink that Chithrax had shared with business partners for thousands of years, and that it had never harmed anyone before, and that this was a terrible accident, not a deliberate attack. The medical staff ran chemical analysis on the remaining liquid in the crystal container and confirmed that it was indeed a standard Chithrax ceremonial beverage with no additives or modifications, and that it contained naturally occurring Zephyrium-9 as part of its fermentation process, which Chithrax biology handled easily, because they had evolved alongside the compound and developed natural resistance over millions of years. Taman finally spoke up from his position on the medical platform and said he felt fine except for a slight lingering burn in his throat and that he did not think Velkar had tried to poison him, and that maybe everyone could just calm down and finish the business negotiation they had started before all this happened. Nobody seemed ready to calm down. And Orndal announced that the station was going into partial lockdown until they could determine whether humans represented a security threat and whether their presence on the station required new safety protocols, and Hyagen started to argue, but a new voice cut through the chaos with clear authority that made everyone stop talking. Miri walked into the medical bay like she owned it, and in a sense she did because she was the human diplomatic representative for this entire sector, and she had been appointed by Earth's Provisional Galactic Relations Council, specifically to handle situations exactly like this one, and she took in the scene with a single sweeping glance, and immediately began issuing orders that somehow everyone obeyed despite having no real authority over alien security forces or medical personnel. She told Orndal that humans were not a security threat, and that this was simply an unfortunate cultural misunderstanding caused by incomplete biological data, and she assured Velkar that no one blamed the Chithrax for what happened, and that Earth would send a formal statement clearing the merchant of any wrongdoing, and she informed the medical staff that they would need to compile a full report on this incident and share it with Earth's medical community so that proper safety guidelines could be developed. Then she turned to Do-hyun and asked him to explain exactly what had happened from a biological perspective, using language that everyone in the room could understand regardless of their scientific background. Do-hyun took a breath and began speaking in the careful, measured tones of a teacher, explaining a complex topic to students who had no foundation in the subject. And he told them that human biology was built on a foundation of redundant survival systems that had evolved on a world with conditions that most galactic species would consider extremely hostile, and that humans could process a remarkable range of toxic substances because their ancestors had survived multiple mass extinction events and adapted to environments that ranged from frozen tundra to baking deserts to deep ocean trenches. He explained that human livers were essentially chemical processing plants, capable of breaking down almost any organic compound given enough time, and that human immune systems were aggressive to the point of being dangerous, and that human cellular regeneration operated at speeds that seemed impossible to species who had evolved on gentler worlds with more stable conditions. Hyejin interrupted to ask what he meant by gentler worlds, and Do-hyun pulled up a holographic display showing Earth's atmospheric composition and radiation levels and gravity and temperature, ranges and seasonal variations and tectonic activity, and the room fell silent as the alien medical staff and security personnel absorbed what they were seeing. One of the medical technicians made a sound that the translator rendered as disbelief and horror mixed together, and asked whether Do-hyun was certain these readings were accurate, because the oxygen levels alone would cause oxidative damage to most species over time, and the radiation from Earth's sun was significantly higher than what most inhabited worlds received, and the gravity would make movement difficult for anyone not specifically adapted to it. Do-hyun confirmed that the readings were accurate and added that humans considered Earth to be a pleasant and comfortable place to live, and that they had trouble understanding why other species found their homeworld so intimidating. Miri stepped in before the conversation could spiral further into panic, and she reminded everyone that humans had been peacefully traveling through space for 3 years now without incident, and that they posed no threat to anyone, and that this situation simply demonstrated the need for better cross-species education and medical protocols. Orndal was not convinced, and he pointed out that a species capable of surviving lethal neurotoxins without even realizing they had been poisoned represented a potential military threat that could not be ignored, and that the Galactic Council would need to be informed immediately. Taman sat up on the medical platform despite protests from the medical staff, and he looked at all the aliens staring at him like he was some kind of dangerous weapon, instead of just a cargo hauler trying to make an honest living, and he told them he was not a threat to anyone and that he just wanted to finish his business deal and maybe get something to eat. The Galactic Research Facility occupied an entire wing of Meridian Station and normally conducted studies on long-term effects of space travel on various species and tested new medical treatments before they were approved for general use and analyzed samples of unknown biological materials discovered on unexplored worlds. But now every available resource had been redirected toward understanding human biology and figuring out whether humans represented a threat that needed containment, or simply an anomaly that required documentation, and the scientists working there ranged from excited to terrified, depending on their personal views about species that could survive what should have been certain death. Taman had reluctantly agreed to participate in voluntary testing after Mirai explained that refusing would only make the situation worse and feed into fears that humans had something to hide, and that cooperation now would make life easier for every human trying to travel or trade in galactic space, and he understood the logic even if he did not particularly enjoy the idea of being studied like a laboratory specimen for the next few weeks, while aliens poked and prodded him and ran endless tests on his blood and tissues. Jiwan arrived on the next transport from Earth and brought with her a portable laboratory worth of equipment designed specifically for human biology, and she introduced herself as a biologist who specialized in comparative xenophysiology and had been studying the differences between human and alien life since first contact, and she told Taman that she would make sure the alien scientists did not accidentally hurt him through ignorance about human tolerances and limitations. Suho came too, even though nobody had asked him to, and he appeared in the research facility with a bag of real Earth food that he had brought all the way from the nearest human colony, and he told Taman that if the aliens were going to treat him like a test subject, then at least he could eat properly while it happened. And Taman had never been so happy to see instant noodles and dried fruit and actual coffee in his entire life. The lead xenobiologist was a being called Dr. Zilmoth, who existed as a floating collection of luminous gas held together by electromagnetic fields that generated its own containment, and it communicated through modulated light pulses that required a sophisticated translator to convert into language other species could understand, and it regarded humans with the kind of intense fascination that scientists reserved for discoveries that overturned everything they thought they knew about how biology worked. Dr. Zilmoth explained that the research would involve comparing human responses to various stimuli against responses from other species, and that everything would be carefully controlled to avoid causing harm, but that some tests might be uncomfortable, and Taman could refuse anything he did not feel safe doing, and Jiwan would monitor everything to ensure the protocols remained within acceptable boundaries for human physiology. They started with baseline measurements and took samples of Taman's blood and hair and skin cells and saliva and ran them through analyzers that produced pages of data about his genetic structure and cellular composition and metabolic processes and immune function, and the results made Dr. Zilmoth pulse in colors that the translator identified as profound confusion, because nothing about human biology made sense according to established galactic understanding of how carbon-based life should work. The first comparison test involved radiation exposure, and they put Taman in a sealed chamber next to chambers containing volunteers from 6 other species, and exposed everyone to identical doses of cosmic radiation, similar to what anyone would encounter during unshielded space travel. And the other species showed immediate cellular damage that required medical intervention to prevent long-term harm. But Taman's cells barely reacted, and his DNA repair mechanisms kicked in automatically and fixed the minor damage within minutes. Dr. Zilmoth increased the radiation dose by a factor of 10, and the other volunteers had to be removed for their own safety. But Taman just sat in his chamber reading a book on his datapad and occasionally looking up to ask when the test would start, and Jiwan had to explain that the test was already running, and Taman seemed genuinely surprised that he was supposed to be feeling something. The toxin tests came next, and they exposed Taman to a series of compounds that ranged from mild irritants to lethal poisons, and carefully monitored his responses, and he processed most of them without any noticeable effects, and the few that did affect him only caused temporary discomfort like the Zephyrium-9 had, and his liver and kidneys worked through everything efficiently, while his immune system remained calm and unbothered. They tested a paralytic agent that worked by blocking neural transmission and should have left Taman unable to move for several hours, but he felt slightly drowsy for about 20 minutes, and then was fine. And they tested a corrosive compound that dissolved the protective gloves one of the technicians was wearing, but only gave Taman a mild rash that disappeared within an hour, and they tested a hallucinogen that was supposed to cause vivid sensory distortions, but Taman just reported feeling a little dizzy and maybe seeing some colors that were slightly brighter than normal. Suho watched all of this from the observation area and finally asked Jiwon whether humans were actually as tough as the tests suggested or if Taman was just unusual. And Jiwon admitted she did not know because Earth had never conducted this kind of systematic comparison with alien biology before. And for all she knew, every human would respond the same way Taman was responding. Dr. Zilmoth seemed to reach the same conclusion and requested permission to test other humans if any were available on the station, and Heejin volunteered immediately because she was not about to let Taman face this alone. And 2 other human traders who were passing through the station heard about the research and offered to participate out of curiosity about what made them different from everyone else in the galaxy. The comparative results were consistent across all 4 humans, and they all showed the same remarkable resistance to radiation and toxins and physical stress, and the same aggressive immune responses and efficient cellular repair and redundant biological systems, and Dr. Zilmoth compiled the data into a preliminary report that it transmitted to the Galactic Medical Council with a warning that human biology operated on principles that did not match any known species. News spread fast through the station and beyond, and within days there were reports coming in from across the galaxy about other humans who had survived situations that should have killed them. And a construction worker on a mining station had been exposed to vacuum when his suit failed and stayed conscious for 90 seconds before being pulled back inside and suffered nothing worse than some burst blood vessels in his eyes. And a freight handler had eaten fermented Vorgel paste as part of a dare, and the paste was known to dissolve metal, but the human just complained about heartburn for a few hours and then was fine. The Galactic news networks picked up the story, and suddenly everyone was talking about humans and their impossible biology, and some of the coverage was fascinated and some was fearful and some was openly hostile and suggested that humans were too dangerous to be allowed to travel freely through civilized space. Yejin spent hours reading through news reports and social media posts from dozens of different worlds and species, and she showed Taman some of the worst ones, including an article that called humans biological weapons and suggested they had been engineered by some unknown civilization for military purposes, and another that demanded humans be quarantined back on Earth for the safety of the galaxy. Taman did not know how to feel about being called a weapon, when all he wanted was to run a small shipping business and make enough money to live comfortably and maybe see some interesting parts of the galaxy. And he told Heejin that none of this was fair because humans had not asked to be resilient, and they certainly had not done anything to threaten anyone. Jiwon found something interesting while reviewing historical records from the early first contact missions, and she discovered that when Galactic scouts first detected human radio transmissions and sent probes to Earth, they classified it as a Class 12 hazard world and recommended that it be placed under permanent quarantine to prevent any species from accidentally settling there and dying from the hostile environment. The classification had been forgotten during the chaos of formal first contact, when humanity reached out through its first faster-than-light communications and requested permission to join the galactic community, and nobody thought to warn humans that their homeworld was considered apocalyptically dangerous by every other species who knew about it. Dr. Zilmoth found the classification data fascinating and pulled up Earth's environmental profile to show the research team, and the numbers told a story that explained everything about human resilience. And Taman looked at the data and saw atmospheric oxygen levels that were marked in red as dangerously high, and radiation exposure that was flagged as extreme, and gravity that was labeled as crush hazard for most species, and temperature variations that would require extensive protection equipment for anyone not adapted to them. The Galactic Council chambers were designed to accommodate representatives from every member species, and the vast circular room had sections with different atmospheric compositions and gravity levels and temperature controls, so that beings from methane breathers to radiation feeders could all participate in governance together. And the humans had been given a small section near the oxygen breathers, because their requirements were closest to that category, even though Earth's oxygen levels were still dangerously high compared to what most of those species considered comfortable. Wunji stood in the human section wearing formal diplomatic attire that she had carefully chosen to appear professional without being threatening, and she held a datapad containing the complete report on human biology that Dr. Zilmoth and Jiwon had compiled over the past month of testing. And she knew that what she said in the next hour would determine whether humans were welcomed into Galactic society or pushed back to their isolated corner of space and treated as dangerous outsiders forever. The council speaker called the session to order and announced that they would be discussing the human question and deciding whether new restrictions or protocols needed to be implemented regarding human travel and settlement rights in galactic space. And the chamber fell silent as thousands of representatives from hundreds of worlds turned their attention to the human diplomat standing alone. In her section, Yunji began by thanking the council for allowing her to present Earth's perspective on the recent discoveries about human biology, and she acknowledged that the information had been surprising and concerning to many species, and that humans understood why some people might be frightened by what they had learned. But she wanted to make it clear that humans had been peaceful and cooperative members of the galactic community for 3 years now, and had done nothing to suggest they posed any threat to anyone. She activated a holographic display and showed Earth rotating slowly in the center of the chamber, and the planet looked beautiful from space with its swirling white clouds and blue oceans and green and brown continents. And she pointed out that to humans this was home, and they had never considered it unusual or dangerous until they met other species and learned that their definition of normal was completely different from everyone else's. Minseo joined the presentation through remote link from Earth and introduced herself as a xenoanthropologist who studied how different species evolved and adapted to their environments, and she explained that Earth's history had been marked by repeated catastrophic events that killed off most life on the planet, but created opportunities for the survivors to evolve new adaptations, and that humans descended from a long line of species that survived ice ages and volcanic eruptions and asteroid impacts and climate shifts that would have wiped out less adaptable forms of life. The holographic display shifted to show Earth's timeline and highlighted the major extinction events that had shaped terrestrial biology, and Minseo explained that human ancestors survived because they developed flexible diets that allowed them to eat almost anything, and efficient metabolisms that extracted maximum energy from minimal food and social structures that let them work together to overcome challenges that would have destroyed individuals, and all of those survival traits were still present in modern humans, even though they no longer face the same environmental pressures. A representative from the Felcor Unity asked whether humans had been genetically engineered to be so resilient, and Yunji firmly denied it, and explained that humans evolved naturally over millions of years, and that their biology was simply the result of adaptation to a world that happened to be more hostile than most, but was still capable of supporting complex life. Admiral Korvax rose from his section, and his massive armored form dominated that part of the chamber, and he spoke in a deep, rumbling voice that the translators rendered as stern and suspicious. And he pointed out that, regardless of how humans evolved, they now represented a potential military threat, because a species that could survive lethal toxins and high radiation and vacuum exposure could also survive battlefield conditions that would disable or kill conventional soldiers, and that the Council needed to consider whether allowing humans unrestricted access to galactic space might upset the delicate military balance between various powers. Yunji had expected this argument, and she calmly responded that humans had no interest in military conquest, and that Earth's provisional government had signed every non-aggression treaty and weapons limitation accord that the Council had presented, and that humans wanted to trade and learn and explore, not fight wars, with species they had just met. Korvax was not convinced, and he argued that intentions could change, and that a species with such remarkable biological advantages should be monitored closely and perhaps restricted to their home system until the Council could be certain they posed no threat. Several other representatives spoke up in support of restrictions and suggested that humans should be required to undergo medical screening before being allowed on any station or planet, and that they should be banned from certain sensitive areas, and that their population should be limited to prevent them from spreading too widely through galactic space. Other representatives argued against restrictions and pointed out that humans had done nothing wrong, and that punishing them for their biology would be unjust and would set a dangerous precedent for how the Council treated species who did not fit established norms. The debate continued for hours, and Yunji listened to dozens of speakers from worlds she had never heard of discuss whether her entire species should be treated as potential weapons or welcomed as fellow citizens, and she kept her expression neutral and professional, even though part of her wanted to scream that humans were just people trying to live their lives and they had not asked to be born on a death world, or to have biology that terrified everyone else. A representative from the Quiln Harmonies finally asked the question that everyone seemed to be avoiding, which was what humans themselves wanted from galactic society, and whether they understood how other species perceived them. Yunji took a breath and answered honestly and said that humans wanted to be treated like everyone else, and that they wanted the same opportunities to travel and trade and settle new worlds and learn from other cultures, and they did not want to be feared or isolated or treated like weapons when they were just ordinary people who happened to come from a harsh planet. Team pulled up data on human behavior over the past 3 years and showed that human traders had maintained perfect safety records, and human diplomats had successfully negotiated treaties without any incidents of violence or aggression, and human scientists had collaborated productively with researchers from 24 different species, and human tourists had visited 50 different worlds without causing any problems, beyond occasional cultural misunderstandings that were quickly resolved. Data showed that humans were peaceful and cooperative, and genuinely interested in being part of the galactic community. And Yunji argued that judging them based on theoretical military potential rather than actual behavior was fundamentally unfair. Taemin had been given permission to address the council as a private citizen with direct experience in the situation, and he spoke simply and directly about his experience on Meridian Station and how he had just been trying to complete a business deal when everything went wrong through no fault of his own or Velkar's, and how he had been treated like a dangerous anomaly instead of a person, and how frustrating it was to be defined by his biology rather than his choices. He told the council that he understood their concerns, but that humans had not chosen to be resilient, and they could not change their biology, and all they could do was promise to continue being peaceful and respectful and cooperative, and hope that other species would judge them by their actions rather than their potential. The council fell silent after Taemin finished speaking, and representatives consulted with each other in dozens of languages and through methods ranging from verbal discussion to chemical signaling to quantum entanglement, and Yunji waited and hoped that humanity's future would not be decided by fear. The vote came down to a narrow margin, and the council decided not to implement new restrictions on human travel, but to require that human medical data be added to all galactic databases so that proper safety protocols could be developed, and to mandate that humans undergo basic safety training about which substances and environments might be dangerous to other species. Even if humans could survive them easily, it was not a perfect outcome, and Yunji knew that humans would still face suspicion and fear from many species. But it was better than being quarantined or treated as weapons, and it gave humanity a chance to prove themselves through continued peaceful interaction. News of the council decision spread quickly, and reactions were mixed, with some species celebrating the decision to treat humans fairly, and others condemning it as dangerous and naive, and some media outlets began running stories about human traders and travelers and scientists and showing that they were ordinary people living ordinary lives. And slowly the narrative began to shift from humans as threats to humans as interesting neighbors. 6 months had passed since the incident, and the galaxy had slowly adjusted to the reality that humans existed and came from a world that would kill most species within hours and possessed biology that made them accidentally terrifying to everyone. Elzen life had settled into a new normal, where humans were still unusual but no longer treated as immediate threats, and the initial panic had faded into cautious curiosity, mixed with lingering nervousness. Meridian Station looked the same as always, with ships coming and going and merchants haggling over goods and travelers stopping for rest between long journeys. But now, humans were a regular presence in the corridors and shops and restaurants, and people had gotten used to seeing them walking around without protective equipment in environments that would require most species to wear atmospheric suits, and eating foods that would poison anyone else, and generally existing in ways that seemed impossible, but clearly were not. Taemin had completed his deal with Velkar eventually, and the Chithrax merchant had become something of a friend over the following months, and they met regularly to discuss business and share meals, and Velkar had even visited Earth briefly and spent 3 days in an environmental suit breathing filtered air and experiencing crushing gravity and dangerous radiation. and when he returned, he told everyone that humans were insane for living there, and that it explained everything about why they were so hard to kill. The trading company that Taemin and Hyejin ran had grown considerably, and they now employed 5 other humans and had contracts with merchants from 7 different species. And their reputation for reliability and their ability to transport goods through conditions that would stop other carriers made them valuable partners. And they were making more money than Taemin had ever imagined when he started. This venture, Young-ho had found work as a security specialist protecting human traders in areas where anti-human sentiment ran high. And there were still extremist groups who believed humans should be expelled from galactic space and who occasionally made threats or worse. And Young-ho had the kind of military training that made him very good at keeping people safe, and his mere presence often deterred trouble because he looked like exactly what he was, which was a human who could survive things that would kill attackers. The first major test of the new normal came when someone tried to poison water supplies at a human trade outpost in the Andali sector, and the perpetrators used a cocktail of toxins that should have killed every human at the facility within minutes and contaminated the entire station's water recycling system. But instead, the humans just noticed that the water tasted funny and reported it to station maintenance as a possible equipment. Malfunction station security traced the contamination back to its source and arrested 3 individuals who belonged to an organization called the Purity Movement that wanted to keep the galaxy free from Death World species, and the arrests made headlines across dozens of worlds and sparked debates about whether anti-human violence would become a recurring problem. Young-ho had been at that outpost when the attack happened, and he personally tracked down the perpetrators before station security even knew what was going on. And he delivered them to the authorities alive and unharmed, despite having every legal right to use lethal force in self-defense. And when reporters asked why he had shown restraint, he said that killing people would only make humans seem more dangerous, and that the best way to fight fear was to prove that humans valued life and followed the law even when attacked. The incident could have made everything worse, but instead it became a turning point, because it showed that humans were not aggressive or violent despite their capabilities, and that they preferred peace and cooperation over conflict, and public opinion began to shift as people saw humans responding to attacks with restraint rather than retaliation. Hana received her acceptance letter to the Galactic Academy 3 weeks after the Andali incident, and she would be the first human student ever admitted to the prestigious institution that trained diplomats and scientists and engineers from across the galaxy, and her acceptance was front-page news on Earth and made significant coverage on alien worlds because it represented tangible progress toward human integration into galactic society. The Academy was located on a world called Theraxis Prime that had been specifically terraformed to accommodate multiple species, and Hana arrived there wearing an environmental suit that regulated her oxygen intake to match local atmospheric conditions and filtered out the excess radiation that humans needed, but would harm most other students. And she felt awkward and conspicuous, but determined to prove that humans could succeed in any environment. Her first weeks were difficult because other students avoided her out of fear or curiosity or both, and professors did not know how to grade a student whose biology let her stay awake for days at a time if needed, and who could work in laboratory conditions that would require others to wear extensive protective gear, and who processed information in ways that were similar to other species but just different enough to be noticeable. But slowly she made friends with a few brave souls who were willing to look past the reputation and see the person. And she found that once people actually talked to her, they realized she was just another student trying to learn and pass her classes, and maybe have some fun along the way. And word spread that the human was actually pretty normal. Despite coming from a Death World ambassador to Karn, was a diplomat from the Sylvan Collective who had spent 30 years working on integration issues between different species and cultures, and he saw in the human situation an opportunity to create new frameworks for acceptance that could apply to any species that did not fit established patterns. And he began working with Mirai to develop what he called the Taemin Protocols, after the human whose accidental survival of Zypherium-9 poisoning had started everything. The protocols were based on the idea that biological differences should not determine rights or opportunities, and that all species deserved equal treatment regardless of how unusual or intimidating their natural capabilities might be. And they included guidelines for medical safety, that protected everyone without restricting anyone, and cultural exchange programs that helped species understand each other better, and educational initiatives that taught tolerance and acceptance. Starting from childhood, Takarn presented the protocols to the Galactic Council, along with data showing that human integration had been largely successful despite initial fears, and that the galaxy was better for including humans rather than excluding them. And he argued that the same principles should apply to any species that might join the galactic community in the future, whether they came from death worlds or water worlds or gas giants or anywhere else. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed with a solid majority, and the Taman protocols became official galactic policy, and Taman himself was invited to the ceremony, where they were formally adopted, and he stood on stage feeling completely out of place in formal clothes while aliens from dozens of species applauded, and his name became permanently associated with integration and tolerance. Yejin told him later that he had become accidentally famous and that their trading company would probably benefit from the publicity, but that she hoped he would not let it go to his head, and Taman promised he would stay focused on the important things like delivering cargo on time and making sure their ships were properly maintained, and maybe occasionally accepting dinner invitations from alien merchants who wanted to meet the human who survived the poison. Velkar organized a gathering 6 months to the day after the original incident and invited everyone who had been there and some new friends besides. And he reserved the same private dining room where everything had started, and he had arranged for food and drinks that were safe for every species present, including humans. Taman arrived with Hyejin and found the room already full of familiar faces, including Dohyun and Jiwon, who had become friends during the testing period, and Suho, who brought samples of his successful Earth food business, and Mire, who rarely had time for social gatherings but made an exception for this occasion, and even Orndal, the security chief, who still looked intimidating, but had softened somewhat after 6 months of peaceful human presence on his station doctor. Chilmoth attended as well and pulsed in warm colors that suggested happiness and contentment, and it told Taman that studying human biology had been the highlight of its career, and that it hoped to continue collaborating with human researchers for years to come. Velkar stood at the head of the table and raised a crystal container filled with amber liquid that was definitely not poisonous to anyone, and proposed a toast to new friendships and unexpected alliances, and the courage to look past fear and see people as they truly were. Everyone raised their drinks, and Taman noticed that Velkar had gotten him a beverage that was perfectly safe for humans and tasted like citrus mixed with honey, with none of the burning sensation that had caused so much trouble 6 months earlier. The meal proceeded with easy conversation and laughter, and stories about the past 6 months and how much had changed and how much remained the same. And Taman looked around the table at beings from half a dozen different worlds who had become friends through circumstances none of them could have predicted. Jiho stood at the window of the shuttle and watched the massive station grow larger in the viewport, his reflection staring back at him with barely hidden anxiety in his eyes, the weight of representing all of humanity pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden he could not shake off, no matter how many deep breaths he took or how many times he reminded himself that he had trained for this moment his entire career, that Earth's best diplomats and scientists had prepared him for every possible scenario. But nothing could truly prepare someone for meeting aliens for the first time, for stepping into a galaxy that had existed for millions of years without ever knowing humans existed at all. And now here he was, Ambassador Jiho from Earth, carrying the hopes and dreams of 8 billion people who waited back home with their eyes glued to screens, and their hearts full of wonder and fear in equal measure, wondering what these advanced civilizations would think of them, whether humanity would finally take its place among the stars or be rejected as too primitive, too young, too violent perhaps, given Earth's bloody history of wars and conflicts that seemed so shameful now when viewed against the backdrop of galactic civilization that claimed to have maintained peace for thousands of years across hundreds of worlds. Captain Yuna sat beside him in the shuttle, her military uniform crisp and perfect, her posture straight and alert as always, her hand resting near her sidearm, even though she had been told repeatedly that weapons would not be needed at the council station, that this was a place of peace and diplomacy. But Yuna had not survived 20 years in Earth's combined military forces by taking anyone's word about safety without verification, and her dark eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, noting exits and potential threats with the automatic awareness of someone trained to protect others. and right now her job was to protect Jiho and the small delegation of scientists and cultural advisors who accompanied them, including Tai Yang, a brilliant scientist who had helped decode the alien messages that first reached Earth 3 months ago, the messages that changed everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the universe, the messages that invited Earth to send representatives to the Galactic Council and request membership in the ancient coalition of civilizations that governed this part of the galaxy. The station was unlike anything humans had ever built, a massive ring of gleaming metal and energy fields that rotated slowly in the void, generating its own gravity through means that Taiyang could barely begin to understand despite his expertise in physics and engineering. And as their shuttle approached the docking bay, they could see other ships from other worlds, vessels of shapes and designs that defied human imagination, some looking like organic creatures more than machines, others appearing to be made of pure crystallized light that hurt to look at directly. And Jiho felt his stomach tighten with nervousness again, because each of those ships represented a civilization far older and more advanced than Earth. Civilizations that had been traveling between stars when humans were still learning to make fire in caves. And what could humanity possibly offer to such beings except perhaps entertainment value or historical curiosity? The docking process was smooth and automated, with the station systems taking control of their shuttle and guiding it into place with precision that made their pilot nervous, because he had nothing to do except watch. And then the airlock cycled open and they stepped out into the council station for the first time. And the air smelled strange, like ozone mixed with something floral that did not exist on Earth. And the gravity felt slightly lighter than Earth normal, making each step feel like a small bounce, and waiting for them was a delegation of aliens. The first aliens that any human had ever seen in person rather than on a screen. And Jiho had to force himself not to stare rudely at their strange forms. The one who stepped forward had a body like an insect, with multiple legs and compound eyes that reflected the station's lights in rainbow patterns. And when it spoke, the words came from a translator device that made its voice sound mechanical and cold, welcoming them to the council station and explaining that it represented the Vrilix Hive, one of the founding members of the Galactic Council, and beside it floated another being that appeared to be made entirely of glowing energy, contained within a vague humanoid shape, introducing itself as a speaker for the Luminar Collective. And there were others too, each more strange and wonderful than the last, and Jiho managed to deliver his prepared greeting speech despite his amazement, thanking the Council for this opportunity, and expressing Earth's desire to join the galactic community in peace and cooperation. The tour of the station took several hours, and with each passing minute, Yuna's unease grew stronger even though she could not point to any specific threat. Just a feeling that something was wrong with the way their alien host spoke to them, a condescending tone in the translated words, a sense that the council representatives viewed humans the way adults might view children playing at being grown-ups. And her suspicions were confirmed when they passed through a section of the station where members of various species worked at menial tasks, cleaning and maintaining equipment, and when she asked about them, the Vrilix representative explained casually that these were species under council protection, worlds that had not yet achieved full membership status and therefore contributed labor as tribute until they proved themselves worthy. And the way it said the word worthy made Yuna's hand drift toward her weapon again, because she recognized the tone of oppression when she heard it. Having fought against it on Earth, in her younger days before the world governments finally united, the formal presentation took place in a vast chamber where representatives from hundreds of species gathered to observe, their forms ranging from comprehensible to utterly alien, some breathing the same air as humans while others remained in sealed environments suited to their biology. And Jiho stood at the center of this assembly and made Earth's case for membership, speaking about humanity's achievements in art and science, about the values of cooperation and dignity that had finally brought Earth's nations together after centuries of conflict, about the contributions humanity could make to the galactic community if given the chance. And he spoke from his heart, letting his passion and sincerity show through, hoping that somehow these ancient beings would see past humanity's youth and recognize their potential. The response was laughter, or at least the alien equivalent of it, a cacophony of sounds and gestures that clearly conveyed mockery and dismissal. And the High Arbiter, an ancient being whose species had been among the first to form the council millennia ago, rose from its position of honor and spoke in a voice that dripped with condescension, explaining that Earth was indeed welcome to join the Council, but only as a protectorate, a lesser member without voting rights or true autonomy, required to pay tribute and follow Council directives without question, because humanity was simply too young and primitive to be trusted with full membership, too violent and chaotic, and perhaps in a few thousand years, if humans managed not to destroy themselves first, the Council might reconsider their status. Jiho felt the weight of billions of watching eyes back home, knowing this moment was being broadcast across Earth, knowing that humanity's future hung on his next words, and he drew himself up straight and looked directly at the High Arbiter, and said clearly that Earth rejected the offer of protectorate status, that humanity would accept nothing less than full and equal membership, that they had not traveled to the stars to become servants or second-class citizens. And the chamber erupted in more laughter, louder this time, and the High Arbiter smiled in a way that showed too many teeth and said that if humanity was so confident, perhaps they would like to attempt the trial of ascension, a series of challenges designed to test whether a species truly deserved full council membership, though the Arbiter warned that no one had passed these trials in 3,000 years, and most species who attempted them withdrew in shame or were destroyed in the process. Yuna saw the trap immediately, saw that this was designed to humiliate humanity and break their spirit, but before she could warn him, Jiho accepted the challenge, his voice steady and sure, and the High Arbiter's smile widened even further as it announced that Earth had one standard galactic year to prepare for the trials, and then the human delegation was dismissed, escorted back to their shuttle while alien representatives whispered and made their versions of jokes about how quickly the humans would fail. And as their shuttle pulled away from the station, Jiho finally allowed his hands to shake, wondering if he had just doomed humanity, or given them their only real chance at freedom among the stars.